I would like to remind you that for more Microsoft webcasts, you can go to microsoft.com/webcasts. Thanks again for joining us for today's presentation, TechNet Webcast Identity Lifecycle Manager 2, Part 3, Extensibility and Provisioning. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's first presenter, Brian Brecken. Brian, you now have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Brian Brecken. I'm a technical product manager in the Identity Lifecycle Manager team. With me today, I have Nima Ganji, who will be doing actually most of the presentations today. Just to remind you that this is a part 3 in the series of the ILM2 presentations. The first presentation was done a couple of weeks ago, actually 3 weeks ago, on empowering users. That presentation goes through the UI and how the end users and IT pros see the product. And then the next level was actually the part 2, which is expressing and enforcing business policy. And expressing and enforcing business policy is more around how to build up your policies and how to create your policies and workflows in here. This last talk will be about extensibility and what extensibility points there are in the product and how you can use them. It's not a talk that goes into code, but it's more around how to actually use the product and extend it to certain new features. The talk today is around level 300. It will be touching 400, I believe. Nima is nodding, maybe not, but at least 300 level. We'll be doing Q&A throughout the talk through the Q&A panel, and also at the end of the talk, we'll do some Q&A verbally with Nima as well. Before I hand it over to Nima, I'd just like to point out a few important features that have been our guidelines when we design ILM2. We kind of call them our design principles, and the design principles are around aligning experience, which is to put the right tools in the right hands, which means that we want to put self-service tools into the end user's hand, which are used in experiences where we used to see group management, for example, inside of Outlook, password reset right at the logon prompt, so you don't have to fire off another portal, fire off all the tools to do these things. And again, also to put the right tools into IT professional hands. You're not supposed to. The design is you don't have to go to a developer to create a workflow. You want to do a very complex workflow. You might need somebody that knows workflow foundation in Visual Studio, but really put the right tools in the right hands of the whole organization in this case. Also put it into something that's called policy management. So integrated policy management is at the core of the product. And I really recommend you to watch the second series in this webcast just to get the policy core features of policy management in there. This is where we decide what happens with users when they flow through the system, what happens with requests when they're sent to the system. We can put in workflows, authentication, authorization, and even action workflows in here. And then the topic of today is the extensibility and making sure that what you have out of the box is a good experience for a lot of core features, but then you will add more functionality and more features on top of the product. The next one is the last one is actually about enhancing existing IT investments, and I've already mentioned things like Office. If you've invested already in the Office 2007 interfaces and Office 2007, you will get a light-up experience, so you get added more features, which doesn't mean that you can't participate in things like joining groups, creating groups, approvals, and rejects if you don't have Office 2000. It's just that you would do it inside of Office or through the portal if you're running older versions of Office, or if you're running Lotus Notes or some other platform in that case. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Nima, and just a second, we're just going to switch seats over here.
Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Nima Ganja. All right, so the focus today, as Brian mentioned, is going to be extensibility in ILM2. Now, the goal of this session is to introduce you all to the extensibility and provisioning features in the product. And a heavy portion of this session is going to be actually spent on demonstrating the use of these features, the extensibility and provisioning features in the product. So this will be very much a demonstrative session rather than a developer session. So rather than walk through coding samples, I'll walk you guys through the product usage and how you can use the product in the real examples to use some of these features in interesting ways. So what does extensibility actually mean in ILM2? Extensibility really boils down to 4 key areas of the product. We have the schema, adapters, web services, and workflows. Now, schema as an extensibility point means that you can, first of all, customize any object that we have shipped out of the box, so you can represent a person or a group, for example, in any way that makes sense to your business. And you can also extend the ILM schema to introduce new object types down the road that you want to manage with ILM2. Adapters or management agents as an extensibility point means that you can extend ILM to connect with any system in your environment so that you can actually begin exchanging data or information in those systems in ILM, so you can manage the information in those systems through ILM. Web services as an extensibility point means that you can take advantage of a rich, fully documented and supported API to build your own custom identity-aware applications. This is the same interface that the solutions ILM2 ships with out of the box actually uses. So you can take advantage of this to your needs as well. Workflows as an extensibility point means you have the ability to introduce your own custom complex policies and business processes that map to what you actually need in your organization. Out of the box, we ship with a set of workflows that we think many of you will need to use in your day-to-day configuration, such as approvals and notifications and provisioning. But you may want to introduce custom workflows, such as custom provisioning workflows or custom authentication, smart card gate workflows. And having an extensibility point here means that you can actually introduce new functionality into the platform itself through this endpoint. So let's dive a little bit into detail on one of the extensibility points now. In terms of schema extensibility, you can see I have here the ILM2 architecture diagram. It's a high-level diagram on display here. I've highlighted a couple of components in the center in the ILM platform. I've circled the ILM service database and the synchronization service database. The ILM service database hosts all the information about the objects managed by ILM. Part of this includes all the schema that ILM has for those objects. And this is really where all the extensibility around schema takes place. So in terms of extensibility in the schema, like I mentioned earlier, you have the ability to customize the existing object types in the schema. So chances are, for example, that the representation of a person we ship with out of the box may not meet the needs that you have in your environment. So you may need some custom attributes on the person object. You can customize that object schema very easily through ILM. Additionally, sometime down the road, you may decide you want to manage assets or resources beyond just users and groups with ILM. So you may want to manage computers or devices. An extensible schema here means you can easily introduce new object types to manage in a very turnkey, simple way. The other component I've circled here is the synchronization database. Now, extensibility in this database with regards to schema means that you can represent the schema of any object that you have anywhere in your environment. So you have many different objects that exist in systems across your environment. Chances are that if you already have a resource that you care about, you may have a system that manages something about that resource, such as an HR system for people. By having an extensible schema in the synchronization service, we can model how those objects are represented in those different systems So then you can map those representations into the representation in ILM. So to recap, schema in ILM is completely extensible. You can modify any of the object types in the schema, add and remove attributes as you wish. You can also introduce new object types. An important thing to note here is that these new object types that you introduce into the schema become first-class citizens of the platform. So there is no such thing as special support for users and groups in ILM. They're really just another use of the extensibility point that we provide out of the box. So if you introduce your own custom object type, you can take advantage of the same rich user interface experiences and policy management and provisioning experiences that are available for users and groups, and take advantage of those for any object type that you introduce. Another key point around extensibility with regards to synchronization is the adapters. Now, I mentioned the importance and the presence of extensibility in terms of schema, so you can model how objects look like in other systems. But extensibility in the form of adapters means that you can connect ILM with any system in your environment. Adapters or management agents are the technology that hooks ILM2 with other connected systems, so other systems that you care about in your environment. Hooking them up into those systems means we can exchange information with those systems. So we can bring data in from those systems, apply policies to them, audit them, and then push that data out to other systems that care about it. An extensible adapter story means that you can introduce new adapters to support any system that you have in your environment and connect those systems with ILM2. Now in ILM2, what we've done is we've taken synchronization apart from being just a standalone application into really being a service that's tightly integrated into the platform itself. So the large investment we've made in making the synchronization service integrated tightly with the rest of the product means you get new benefits such as improved auditing. So you can now actually audit and report on changes that come in from the synchronization service. So if you, for example, sync in information about group memberships from Active Directory, you can report on the group membership change history for those groups, or what the group looks like at a particular point in time. Sync configuration through web services means that you can configure your synchronization rules and your configuration in a test environment, and then bootstrap that configuration through the web services onto your production environment or another environment, so you don't have to redo a lot of that configuration work. Multi-mastering allows you to have multiple systems that manage or are authoritative for a specific or single object. So here you can have, for example, an HR system that manages some personal information about a user, like job title and salary, and another system such as Active Directory that manages other information for that user, such as manager. And finally, with synchronization in ILM2, we've kept the old method of doing synchronization, so it's still there. For those of you familiar with ILM 2007, your existing management agent configurations will continue to work, and you can continue to use the old scripted flow approach to doing things, where you can write code in Visual Studio for your flows. However, as part of an effort to make synchronization and provisioning as turnkey as possible, in ILM2 we've introduced a feature called codeless provisioning, which allows you to perform many of those common provisioning and synchronization scenarios without having to write code like you used to have to do. So at the heart of codeless provisioning is the concept of synchronization rules. Now, synchronization rules are objects or rules in ILM that define the relationships and transformations between objects in ILM and objects in other systems that you connect with. So these synchronization rules replace what used to be, your configuration in your management agents and your scripted flows. So now you have a set of synchronization rules that you create through a web portal interface that define how objects in ILM or other systems exchange data about each other. Synchronization through codeless provisioning is fully auditable and workflow based. So we have this concept, we have two attributes on every object now in ILM. One is called an expected rules list, and the other is called a detected rules list. And these two attributes drive the process around synchronization. An expected rules list on every object contains all the synchronization rules that you've applied, that you've intentionally applied to that object. So this would, for example, for a user, contain the different representations that that user is supposed to have in other downstream systems. An example would be, for example, an HR account or an AD user account, an SAP role. So these are different synchronization rules that if you apply to a user would appear in his expected rules list. The detected rules list contains the actual state of the object in other systems. So what does ILM actually detect the user has in other systems? So if we detect that the user has an AD account, but you notice that he isn't supposed to have that account because it doesn't show up in his expected rules list, you maybe we should take some corrective actions. And in a moment, I'll actually show you this entire provisioning process and how you can configure it in ILM2. So adapters, for those of you familiar with ILM 2007, this is management agents, and this part of technology is carried over from ILM 2007. So here, what we have is the technology that actually enables ILM2 to hook into other systems in your environment. Out of the box, we ship with over 20 adapters, so there's support for many of the common systems that you all use out there. And we also ship an extensible management agent or adapter. This MA allows you to customize it and build basically a connection or a hook into any system in your environment. So if you add any system, any custom proprietary system that we don't support out of the box, then you can actually tie that into ILM through the extensible MA. In the future, we'll be releasing additional management agents based on popularity or customer demand. So now that we've had a quick intro into a couple of the key extensibility points in terms of synchronization and schema, let's actually take a look at how we can use these extensibility points in the product. So let's step back and take a real business problem to drive our scenario here. The business problem I'm thinking of now is managing computer assets. So out of the box, ILM2 ships with support for managing users and groups, but there's no experience or support around managing computers. So we want to, for example, have policies and a special experience around managing computers. We want to add computers to security groups and sync all that information out to Active Directory or other systems that care about it. Today we do that through Active Directory users and computers directly, and there's no special, nice experience around that, no way for us to define the complex policies that ILM2 has or audit that in the way ILM2 allows you to. So the capabilities we're going to take advantage of to enable this scenario through ILM2 is an extensible schema. So we want to actually now add support for computers into our schema, and codeless provisioning. So we'll walk through how we can configure the system to synchronize data about computers out to Active Directory without writing any code. So without any more delay, I'll jump right into the product demonstration now, and we'll go through ILM2 and actually look at how we can use the product to achieve this. So what you're seeing right now is the ILM2 homepage, and here I'm logged in as the administrator, so I have a more rich interface than would be available to a typical end user of the product. You can see I have my typical user and group management options, and I have an administrative task list here of things I can do as an administrator. The first thing we need to do in order to add support for managing computers is extend the ILM schema to support them. We do this through extending the schema in the schema management page. So I'll click on the link to that page now, and right now what we see is a list of all the object types that ILM supports out of the box. You'll notice that there's already an object type called computer here. So adding computers or any other object type into the schema is a very straightforward process, as you'll see in a moment. However, if you have a lot of attributes that you want to bind, depending on how many you have, the process can be a little bit repetitive and time-consuming. So for the sake of the demo, what I've done is I've actually added the object type and attributes to the schema, and then what we'll do is we'll walk through now exactly what needed to be done to get the schema extensions in place. So let's go ahead and click on computer here. And now in a moment what we'll see is exactly what information I needed to provide to add a computer to our schema. And you can see I had to provide a system name and a display name, so what name actually shows up in our UI. You can see not much information was needed at all. I provide this much information, and now just like that, I have a brand new object type fully supported in our platform. I'll cancel out of this page now. So the next thing we have to do once we have a new object type in the system is define what the representation for that object type needs to be. So what attributes does that object type need to have? We do that by going to the attributes page and creating new attributes for it. In our case, one of the attributes I created for computers was a serial number attribute. So let's search for that. And you can see it shows up here. So I'll click on this. And now we'll take a look at exactly what information needs to be provided to add a new attribute to the schema. So here we have a serial number attribute. So I named it serial number and gave it the same display name. I selected a data type, which was string. And I specified that this is not a multi-valued attribute. So this is all the information I had to provide to get a new attribute into the system. So if you're introducing, for example, a custom employee ID attribute for users or any other attribute you want on a custom object type, it's a very simple process. Another thing I want to point out here is this validation tab. What this allows you to do is enter a regular expression that performs validation on that attribute's value at the schema level. So, for example, I can type in a regular expression that defines the syntax a serial number for a computer must have. I could have added similar validation onto a display name or a phone number attribute, for example. In our case, I'm not going to add any validation here, so I'll cancel out. And now that I have my object type, which is computer, my custom attribute, which is a serial number, I now need to connect that new attribute to that object type. I do that by creating a binding. So let's go to our bindings page. And here are all the bindings out of the box. There's multiple pages of them, obviously. So I'll search for the serial number binding, and let's bring this up and see what information needs to be provided to bind a custom attribute to a custom object type. So all you have to do is specify the object type, which in our case is a computer, and the attribute we're binding to, which in our case is serial number. And that's it. Now we have actually connected that attribute to that object type. We can specify if this is a required or non-required attribute. And finally, there's validation at the binding level as well. So if you want an attribute to have universal validation across any object type it's bound to, you can add the regular expression at the attribute level. And if you want validation per object type, so for example, you want display name or phone number to have a different syntax validation depending on what object type it's bound to, you can add that at the binding level. So I'll cancel out, and now what we've done in a matter of minutes is actually extended the ILM schema to fully support computer object types. At this point, we can begin creating and managing computers just like other objects in the system. However, as I mentioned earlier when we introduced the business problem, the place where we really care about this information ending up is in Active Directory. So how do we go and configure ILM2 to be able to automatically provision new computers that we create out to AD? We do this in ILM through synchronization rules, as I mentioned earlier. So let's go ahead to our administration page now and move into our synchronization rules page, where we will create our synchronization rule for provisioning computer objects. In a moment, what we'll see is all the default synchronization rules that I've already created. You can see there's some for provisioning users and groups. And here I have a placeholder synchronization rule for provisioning computers to Active Directory. So I'll click on this now, and we'll walk through the steps of configuring the system to synchronize computers out to Active Directory. So in our case, like I mentioned, a synchronization rule defines a relationship and transformation between objects in ILM and objects in other connected systems. In our case, we're defining a relationship between computers in ILM and computers in Active Directory. So here in my synchronization rule interface, I'm at the general information page where I enter some basic information, such as the name, which I chose to say provision computers to AD. And the flow type is the other important piece of information here. A synchronization rule can either bring data in from another system, or it can push data out from ILM to another system. In our case, we're pushing data about computers out from ILM to Active Directory, so this is an outbound synchronization rule. The next step is for us to define the scope of this synchronization rule. The scope determines what objects and what connected system this synchronization rule applies to. In our case, we're connecting computers in ILM with computers in Active Directory. You'll notice that I can select any system that I have connected with through adapters. So here I have an HR system, for example, that I had an adapter for. I could create a synchronization rule for that as well. And I can similarly create a synchronization rule to connect with any object type on that connected system. So now that we've scoped our sync rule to computers in AD, let's go ahead and define our relationship criteria. Now the relationship criteria determines how we identify computers in ILM that are related or connected to computers in Active Directory, and how we create or terminate those relationships. So here we have a set of relationship criteria. These are conditions that, when met, indicates that we have a computer in Active Directory that is connected or related with a computer in ILM. In our case, we've said a computer in ILM is connected to a computer in AD if they share the same display name. We can add as many conditions as we want, and they can be based on any attributes on the object schema. The next step is to specify what should happen if we don't find a computer in Active Directory that's connected with a computer we have in ILM. So we create a new computer in ILM, and we don't find any computer with the same display name as this computer in Active Directory, right? So there's no computer in AD that meets the relationship criteria. In our case, do we want to create the object in the connected system? Well, in our case, we do, because we want to provision new computers if they don't exist in AD. So we have this option selected. The final option is to specify what should happen when we no longer want these two computers to be connected to each other. So what should happen if we delete a computer in ILM or remove the synchronization rule from the computer's expected rules list, meaning we want to terminate that relationship? Do we want to just disconnect the two objects, or do we want to disconnect them and allow the object in Active Directory to also be deleted? By selecting this option, we enable the deprovisioning scenarios, where when ILM detects that the connection is broken, meaning that the object no longer exists in ILM, we can automatically delete it in Active Directory. So this enables scenarios such as, automatically deprovisioning all user accounts when he gets fired from an HR system. Finally, the last step is for us to specify our outbound attribute flows. And this is the transformation criteria for how an object or computer in ILM is transformed into a representation in Active Directory. We do this by defining a set of attribute flows. An attribute flow specifies a set of source values to flow to a destination attribute. In our case, our destination will be attributes on the computer object in AD. So let's go ahead and create our first attribute flow. The first thing I want to do is specify what display name a new computer in Active Directory should have. So I'm defining a flow for the computer's display name. I selected that as my destination. Next, I want to say what my source value should be. So what value do I want to flow out for the computer's display name? In this case, I'll do a direct mapping and flow the computer's display name from ILM to its display name in AD. So here we have a simple direct flow. I'll click OK, and we've created our first attribute flow. Next, I want to create an attribute flow for the computer's distinguished name in Active Directory. So my destination attribute is going to be DN. Now, what do we want as my source value? So what value do I want to flow out for DN? I have a list of options here. You can see I can flow attributes. I can flow constants, so it's constant string or number in my flow. Or I can make use of some advanced capabilities in this UI. So if I select the function here, what you'll see is a list of tools or helper functions such as write, proper casing, random number generation, conditional statements, and other functions that take as inputs some value that could come as a constant input or an attribute and transform that into another value that we want to send to our destination. So previously, you would have to write a lot of these functions with code in ILM 2007, whereas now they're included in this wizard so that you can make those complex flows without having to write any code. In our case, what I want to do is use a custom expression which allows me to type in short form syntax any combination of attributes, constant values, or functions directly in here. This is for the more advanced user who's now accustomed to using functions a lot. And you can just type it directly into here as a short form and it will flow out. In my case, I have a custom expression which I'll grab from this predefined text here. This custom expression is taking a constant string, cn, concatenating it through this operation with the display name of the computer, and then concatenating it with this location. So that's the flow I'm going to use from my distinguished name here. I'll click OK. And just like that, I've created my two flows. I want these flows to apply on creation, so I'll select this initial flow option, and I click OK. I'll submit. And what I've just done is I've configured ILM to be able to provision new computers out to Active Directory automatically without writing any code. So now let's go and test this out. Let's go and create our first computer object. So I'll go to my administrative page here, and you'll see I have an option for all resources here. Whenever you add a new object type into the schema, an entry is created for it here automatically under all resources. And this gives you a default automatic user interface for creating and managing those objects. You can go and customize that interface to make it look however you like. So you saw, for example, the interface we had for synchronization rules. I could create something fancy like that for computers if I wanted to. But for now, let's just stick to the default UI. So I'll go to all resources. We see computers is listed as an object type I can manage here. I'll click that. And we have no computers created at the moment. So let's create our first one. I'll give the computer a display name. We'll call it PC1. I'll click Next. And here you can see it's asking me for a serial number, which is the attribute we just binded earlier to the computer object type. I'll give it a serial number, 123. Click Finish, Submit. And what we've just done is, in a matter of minutes, really, we've gone and configured the platform to now fully support, as a native object type, computer objects, and be able to provision it out to other systems. So if I bring this computer object up now, you'll notice in my expected rules list, I have that synchronization rule we just created, which was provisioning computers to AD. I mentioned that the expected rules list drives the provisioning process here. So now I know that I expect this computer to have a representation in Active Directory. And the synchronization service also recognizes this attribute and ensures that what we want to take place actually does take place, and this computer gets provisioned out. So let's bring up our AD console and see if our computer got provisioned out. And you can see it has. So the computer we just created in ILM just got provisioned out to Active Directory for us automatically. So now I'm going to switch back to our slides. We'll just wait a moment for it to come up. And what we just saw was schema and provisioning as extensibility points. So this takes us to another key extensibility point in the product, which is policy and workflows. This diagram is showing you, again, the ILM2 architecture. And what's circled here are some key components of the request processing pipeline. Now, for those of you that want an in-depth look or analysis of these different components, I strongly suggest you view the webcast on management policy rules, because that goes into detail around how policies are managed and applied in ILM. So in ILM2, what we have is whenever there's a request that enters the system, so any operation that's requested from the system, it always enters the request processing pipeline and becomes subject to a write check, authentication workflows that you specify, authorization workflows that you specify, such as approvals, and finally action workflows that you specify, such as provisioning or notification workflows. The important thing to note about this in terms of extensibility is that all these workflows, authentication, authorization, and action workflows, are based on the Windows Workflow Foundation. So this means that if you can build these workflows in Visual Studio using Windows Workflow Foundation, you can actually bring it into the system and plug it into a request processing pipeline at any point you like. So you can bring in your custom authentication, authorization, or action workflows. Out of the box, we have a small set of workflows that are commonly going to be used. Many of you will have requirements that span outside of those, such as a custom validation workflow for ensuring uniqueness of an account name, for example, or a smart card gate for authenticating users. You can introduce these new workflows by creating custom activities that perform those operations you need. So you can have a custom Q&A activity or a custom smart card gate, custom provisioning workflow. You can build these activities in Visual Studio and bring this into the ILM portal. So let's go back to our business problem, which is managing computer assets. What we saw earlier was how easily we can extend the platform to be able to synchronize and actually manage computers, but we didn't actually see how we can apply policies to those computers. So we didn't create a management policy rule or any workflows around the creation of those computer objects. What we want to do now is show how easy it is for us to have policies specific to computers. So we have workflows and policies that make sense for users and groups. In our case, those workflows and policies may not make sense for computers, for managing computers. So we may want to introduce a custom workflow. So let's walk through an example now in the product of actually now introducing a custom policy around managing computers and a custom workflow for computer management. So I'll switch back to my demo here. And what we want to do is create a policy that requires some sort of validation or authorization when someone tries to create a new computer. We don't want to allow the introduction of just any computer into the system. We want to have a process there that makes sure that the computer is a valid one. So in our case, for other objects like group membership changes, we use approvals as our authorization process. So whenever somebody wanted to add a user to a group, we could have to a privileged group, we could have an approval workflow file. In the case of computers, that policy does not make much sense because typically when we introduce new computers into the system, we introduce them in large quantities. At least at Microsoft we do, where we introduce hundreds, if not thousands at once. So the process of having somebody sit there manually and approve all of them does not make much sense. So we want to create a policy that performs automatic validation of a computer based on serial number whenever we try to create a new computer. So let's go to our management policy rules page here and create this policy. What you'll notice in a moment is a list of all the policies that exist out of the box with ILM2. There's policies that govern the creation of groups or privileged security groups. There's authorization workflows that run when someone tries to create a dynamic group. So we see all of these policies here. So let's add a new management policy rule. Again, I strongly suggest you refer to the management policy webcast to get much more in depth in terms of how these rules actually work in ILM. But in our case, what we want to do is create a policy such that whenever anybody tries to create a new computer, there's an authorization workflow that validates the serial number of that computer. So let's give our policy a name. We'll call it computer validation. I'll click next. And now what we have to do is specify who this policy applies to. So again, in our case, we want to have a policy that applies whenever anybody tries to create a new computer. So our requesters is a set of all people. So I'll type that in, and I'll let the system actually resolve what set of objects that is. And our operation is create, because we want this policy to apply when anybody tries to create a new computer. So next, we want to specify what set of objects in ILM this applies to. So the policy applies when somebody tries to create a new computer. So our target resource is a set of all computers. So again, we'll let the system resolve what set of objects this is for us. And now up to this point, we've specified that the policy should take effect whenever anybody in the system tries to create a new computer object. The final step is for us to specify what should happen when somebody tries to create a new computer. So we can select here any sequence of workflows we want to fire. So once this request enters our policy pipeline or request processing pipeline, like we saw in the diagram earlier, what workflows do we want to fire? We can have authentication associated, so a Q&A gate, for example. We have the choice of some authorization workflows, such as an approval, and we have action workflows that can run, such as provisioning or notifications. The workflow we want is a workflow, an authorization workflow that validates the serial number of the computer to make sure it's a valid computer. You'll notice that we don't have such a workflow here because ILM doesn't provide it out of the box. So what we need to do is go offline and create that custom workflow and bring it into the system so we can use it in this policy. So I'll click Finish for now. And what we've done is we've created a policy that right now is a placeholder, right? The policy is not taking any actions at the moment. It's going to recognize whenever anybody tries to create a computer, but it won't do anything because we haven't specified any workflows for it to run. So let's go and bring in our custom workflow for validating new computers. We'll go to our workflows page here, and you'll notice we have a list of workflows, default workflows here. We could reuse the administrative approval workflow that you've seen used in the policy or self-service talks, but again, that workflow does not make much sense in the context of computers where we want the process to be streamlined and automated. So let's click New to bring in our own custom workflow. I'll type a workflow name. We'll say computer validation. And this is an authorization workflow. So that means this workflow will run after the actual operation has been permitted and the user has been authenticated. Now we want to make sure to put in a final check to ensure that the computer that we're trying to introduce is actually a valid one. So we'll click Next. And you'll notice I have some default activities I can pick here. But the one I want is not there. What I actually want is a custom workflow I want to bring into the system. So what I've done is I've gone offline and built a custom workflow. It's a very simple workflow in this case that looks up the serial number of any new computer that's added to the system against an external data source, which in this case is this data source, a simple CSV file that contains a list of computers and serial numbers. So if the computer is not in that list, it's going to reject it. And what I've done is I've created that workflow in Visual Studio and exported the workflow's XAML definition. So this is the definition of my workflow. It has a reference to the assembly of the workflow, which I wrote offline. Now what I want to do is import that workflow definition into ILM so I can begin using that custom workflow as I please. So I'll click this Import XAML option, and now I can simply specify I want to bring in my custom workflow. So now what I've done is I've created my very own custom workflow. So I've imported the computer serial number validation workflow into ILM now, and I can actually begin using it in policies just like any other workflow. So let's go back to our policies page and find that computer policy. We'll find that policy, and here it is. We'll bring it up, and what we want to do is tell the policy what it should do when it detects that a new computer is being created. So what we want to do is go and modify our Workflows tab to now specify that it should run that new computer validation workflow. So you'll see that it shows up here now. I select the workflow. It's been selected for me. I could select multiple workflows if I want to apply. Now I'll click OK. Submit, and what I've done is I've created a policy that will automatically validate the serial number of a new computer against an external data source. So let's test this out. I'll go back to my All Resources page, my computer page, and let's try to create a new computer now. We'll call this computer Computer 1. Now let's give it an invalid serial number. I'll click Finish, submit, and you'll notice I got an access denied error. So rather than having an administrator or somebody else have to manually verify that this was an invalid computer and approve it or reject it, we had the workflow automatically reject this based on the fact that its serial number was not a valid one. So I'll go back now, and I'll correct this to make it a valid serial number. So let's give it one that wasn't. Click Finish, Submit, and you'll notice that this one passed. So the computer was created successfully. So just like that, we've seen how we can reuse the policies and customize them and workflows to the specific needs of our new object type. Let's switch back to our slides now, and this brings us to our final extensibility point, which is the web services. So far you've seen the schema, synchronization, and custom policies and workflows. Another key point that we have in the product in terms of extensibility is the web services. So here at the top of this diagram, you see the self-service solutions we ship with out of the box, such as group management, user management, and credential management, and also the policy management solution we ship. There's an icon there for custom solutions. This represents the ability for you to be able to introduce any custom identity management solution that you want to build on top of ILM2. Any custom solution that you introduce here will be built on top of the ILM Web Services endpoint. And this endpoint is an XML endpoint that's shown in this diagram, circled in red. It just so happens that this endpoint or interface is the exact same interface that the out-of-the-box solutions ILM delivers use. So any solution that you want to deliver will have the exact same functionality and API available to it that the solutions that ILM ships with out-of-the-box have. So if you take a look at the product now from a developer's perspective and look at the fact that we have this very powerful, rich, supported web service API and a knowledge base out there already for this workflow technology that you can use for extensibility in terms of Windows Workflow Foundation, this product really becomes a goldmine in a developer's hands. As if you're comfortable writing code or have someone at your disposal that's comfortable writing code, you can accomplish a lot in ILM2. You can extend the platform's core functionality through the use of workflows, and you can build custom solutions, such as a custom reporting solution, on top of the ILM Web Services. Now, when I refer to the web services, you may be thinking that this consists of a very complicated, huge set of APIs that you have to go out and study intensely. But in reality, the web service API in ILM really boils down to a basic set of operations. In the ILM web service, you can create, read, update, and delete objects. You can enumerate or query for objects. And you can get the schema for objects through our metadata exchange or MEX endpoint. So there really is not much complexity to our web service API at all. There's only a limited set of API or functionality that it exposes. Here we have a sample payload just for demonstration of what an actual message, a web service message over the wire would look like with ILM. Here we have a request to delete an object. So the action type here is transfer delete, and there's the ID of the object specifying what objects we want to delete. Now you may be wondering that if the API is this simple, where all you can do is create, read, update, and search for objects, how do you actually accomplish anything? So how do you provision objects, or how do you run workflows and perform all these interesting scenarios? Well, in ILM we ship some out-of-the-box objects that are special to the system, the configuration objects. These objects manage the way that the system behaves. So these objects, you've seen some of them already in the demos, such as the schema, workflows, management policy rules, sets, and synchronization rules. When you create or update these objects, you're in effect manipulating the behavior of the system. And this is the only way we could actually have the system boil down to a very simple set of APIs that you can use. So let's go back to our business problem now and look at how we can take advantage of our web service endpoint to perform an actual valuable scenario with the product. In our case, so far we've seen custom schema, custom provisioning, and also a custom workflow. what if we want a custom experience around managing computers? So rather than going through, that user interface and entering that information for every computer we want to create, what if we want to have a client on top of the web service that does a bulk creation of computers from external files? So in this case, what we need to do is take advantage of our web services endpoint extensibility. Let's dive back into the demo now and take a look at how we can take advantage of our web services endpoint to produce custom functionality. So here what I've done is I've gone offline and created a very simple, bare bones client on top of the web services. What I've done is I've created a PowerShell client. So here you see a PowerShell window that supports a very simple operation, which is to create computers. So what I'll do right now is I'll go in here in this text file I have and I'll grab my little PowerShell script, and what the script does is it runs through all the contents of an imported file, that computer list that you saw us validate against earlier, and submits an operation to the web services to create a computer for each one it finds. So it just loops through that file and submits an operation to the client. So this provides us an experience that's very nice around computers, where we often want to manage them in bulk. So we want to introduce computers in bulk or delete them in bulk. So you could build your own custom client such as this very simply on top of the ILM Web Services interface. And what's happening right now is that for each computer that I'm trying to create, the request is being created for that operation, and it's actually going through our pipeline, request processing pipeline. So that policy that we created is actually applying to all of these computers we're creating. So valid ones are the only ones that get permitted. I'll refresh the computers page now. And what we'll notice in a moment is that all the computers that I had in my external file have been created through the web services. So my portal cache is timed out here for a minute, so let's let the cache refresh. And one thing I want to point out is that that PowerShell client that I created, because it was so straightforward and simple in terms of its operation, took me less than a day to build. So it's once you have the documented API at your disposal, it's very straightforward to actually start building your own client. So here we can see we have all the new computer objects that we created. If I bring one of them up, we'll notice that it automatically had that synchronization rule we created applied to it. So this computer now, just like the other one we created, will automatically be provisioned out to Active Directory. So again, now up to this point, what we've seen in the series of demos is how we can take ILM from a point where it has no concept of an object type that we want to manage, such as computers, and extend it fully from not only being able to create and manage those, but be able to provision them out to other systems, apply custom policies to them, and then have a custom experience around managing those computers. So let's bring back up our Active Directory console, and you'll notice that all those computers were automatically provisioned for us, and we didn't have to write any complex code to do that. So I'll go back to my slides now, and what we've seen up to this point is very much how we can use each of the different extensibility points, such as the web services, the schema, the workflow, and the adapters in a real business problem to solve it. So what I want, hopefully, you guys to walk away from this session with an understanding of is what these different extensibility points are, why they're valuable. So why is it valuable to have web services, schema, workflow, and adapters as an extensibility point? And how can you actually now use those extensibility points in a real business problem? So some quick logistics here. You may be wondering what you actually need to run the product. Well, for the client bits, so for having Outlook integration or other bits that you've seen in some of the other demos, you'll need to have XP Service Pack 2 or Windows Vista, and you'll need Office 2007 if you want the rich support for the Outlook client. For the server, so for running the ILM server, which is what I've been demonstrating today, you'll need a 64-bit version of Windows Server 2008, SharePoint Services 3, SQL Server 2008, and Exchange Server 2007 if you wish to have the integrated group and request management experience with Outlook. So as next steps, if you want to find more information about ILM2, please visit the ILM2 website at microsoft.com/ILM2, and you can download the bits or the virtual image for the demo that I actually showed you guys. So this was based on the release candidate image that we provided. So I just went and customized that a little bit for this demonstration. And finally, in terms of availability, ILM2, the release candidate is already available, and the RTM, so the release to market, will be available in the first quarter of 2009. So it's coming up soon. Now we'll open up to any leftover questions and answers, which, according to Brian, who's sitting beside me, there seems to be none. So he's handled some questions during the session. If there are any, we can take them on right now. So I can see a question that says, can I have a user defined with its details splitted, having the credentials in Active Directory and contact details in CRM? So basically what you want is multiple systems. So without getting specific to this particular scenario, you're essentially asking if you can have multiple systems that manage information of an object, right? In this case, you want AD to manage some information about a user and CRM to manage some information about a user. Absolutely, right? This is where the whole concept of multi-mastery comes into play as one of our synchronization features. So you can have as many systems as you want, managing different pieces of that object. So if there are any other questions, you can either send them through now, or you can actually email me or Brian later on, or post questions to our new use groups. So feel free to post any questions you have or contact us directly. And over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Nima. As Nima said, if you have any questions for our presenters, go ahead and submit those using the Q&A pane, or you can email them. I would like to remind everyone that you may print a PDF of the slides by clicking Control-P. You can either print or save the slides locally for your convenience. You should all be seeing a survey now in your slide area. If you could take a moment to fill it out before you log off, we do appreciate any feedback you leave for us. All you need to do is follow the links provided to complete the evaluation. And I do see a couple more questions coming in, so with that, I'm going to hand the floor back to Nima.
So I've seen a couple of questions that came through right now, and I want to address them openly for you guys. The first question is ILM2 compatible with ADFS, so Active Directory Federation Services? The answer to this is no, ILM2 doesn't have support for single sign-on right now. So that's something to look into in the future, but at the moment we have no support for that. The other question is, can you control the sync engine via web services, or do you have to do everything through WMI? So sync configuration is another key area in ILM that we addressed in terms of having better support for it. So here we can manage everything in ILM through web services. So yes, you can actually manage sync configuration through the web services rather than WMI. You can continue to use WMI, but I'm thinking most people will probably start using the web services to do that. Finally, how do you create a web service extension? Excellent question. So you saw my PowerShell example, which was so the PowerShell example was an application built on top of the web service. So I'm assuming that what you're asking here is how do you build a custom solution on top of the web services? There's no way you can actually extend the web services, but you can actually build applications on top of the web services. And you do that by just coding through Visual Studio. And right now, we actually have the documentation in our SDK that guides you through what you need to do for that. So if you go to the Connect site and download the release candidate, along with that, you can download the documentation, the SDK for that, where it describes the protocols and the API for our web services and how you can code against that. Over to Sean.
This is Brian again. If you go to the Microsoft.com/ILM2 page, there's technical resources, and from there you can actually get access to what Nima pronounces the Connect site, which is our Connect.Microsoft.com site, where we have news groups and more features around the product. You also have some links to some of the product group blogs. Nima has a blog, and there's an extensibility blog as well, where some of this is also discussed.
Right. We actually have, so I have a blog that I share with the team for Bobby Gill, where we focus on some of the provisioning capabilities and the extensibility points. A teammate of mine, Joe Shulman, also has a blog specifically for the web services. So there's some good resources out there that you can tap into and some good contacts you can take advantage of. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up this webcast as more questions coming in. So thanks a lot, everybody. And hopefully we'll hear from you guys again.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Okay, I'd like to remind everyone to take a moment to fill out the survey prior to exiting the session room. And with that, I'd like to extend a special thanks to Nima Ganja and Brian Brecken for today's presentation. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of today's conference.